Well, first of all, like Ivano, I want to thank Anna Maria, but also Ivano for organizing this. We always knew they were masters of organization, and now we know they are masters of deception. So this is good to know going forward. I also want to thank them for giving me this opportunity, because I'm Gennaro's oldest student in both senses of the word, I'm afraid. But today he beats me, he's 60. So there are things that you probably remember, well, at 60, memory fades. So I thought after 23 years, a little update on the acknowledgements would not be out of, it would be appropriate. So here goes. So, but Ivano is responsible, Gennaro. If you don't like what I say, he said I should tell people what you were like in the 80s, because you know, it's a long time ago. So I'll start by telling you when I first heard the name Gennaro Chierchia. It was 28 years ago, almost to the day. I was a second-year graduate student at Cornell. And for some reason that I don't remember, I had cut the first week of classes. You know, what the heck. So when I came back, the place was abuzz with talk about this smart young professor who was teaching us Semantics 1. Now, the smart young professor had not yet written his famous textbook. So he was not rich then, like he is now. But, which meant that it was a rocky first few weeks in that class. And, oh, can I show you something else? 28 years ago. That's Gennaro. So this was what I heard about when I came. This young professor who was so wonderful. Anyway, so it was a very rocky beginning, I'm afraid. And I forget what exactly he was teaching, but I was lost. And so when you're lost, you think more pleasant thoughts. So I was thinking some pleasant thoughts when I hear this voice saying, Venita, do you have a question? So I don't have a question. And of course, the class all, you know, it came to a stand. I don't know how. Anyway, it went on. Later, I went to his office to apologize and to tell him I was not the only one. Everybody else was lost too, except they weren't going to tell him that. So with that blunt exchange that was the basis of a very strong friendship that sustained me through graduate school. And I have to say that when I think back to those years, I mean, I'm sure there was stress, but I don't remember it. All I remember was it was a lot of fun. So if you have an advisor who doesn't give you stress, I guess you can have a lot of fun in graduate school. So that was something I wanted to share. The second thing I wanted to say, which I think Gennaro should remember from my dissertation acknowledgements, I consider myself extremely lucky to have had him as my advisor. More so than perhaps other people. I mean, everyone is lucky to have him as an advisor. But more so because I was a very unlikely student for him. I knew very little linguistics, very little. No math almost, certainly no philosophy. But I had one thing going for me that perhaps other people don't. He wasn't yet surrounded by smart young people. You guys all came later. So I had the benefit of his attention. And that changed my professional life completely. So sometimes I wonder what would have happened if he had said no, or if I hadn't had the guts to ask. I mean, if you guys were around, hey, I probably wouldn't have asked. And then what would I have done? I think I would have done decent syntax because there were other people there. But knowing my interests, I would probably have dabbled in semantics, and then I would have done awful semantics. So, Gennaro, thank you for saving me from myself. Then I also want to say one last thing. I have to thank him for suffering through, I don't know, hours and hours of things he couldn't possibly have been interested in. So remember, this is the 80s. This is before Gennaro went cross-linguistic. So no parameters with switches leading to arguably elegant systems with far-reaching consequences. None of that at the time. And what was I working on? correlatives, whatever they are. And not just correlatives, multiple correlatives. And I was bringing what was my intuition? They're just like multiple WH questions, Higginbotham and May. To a guy, Italians don't have multiple WH questions, right? Like you guys package your information one thing at a time. No one cares who did what. So here I was bringing all these things that, I didn't even realize that he couldn't possibly be interested in this. And so, he never, so the thing is, we all know about Gennaro's humble, noble style. This is how someone at the Stanford Institute described him. He's so humble, noble. And we used to tease him about this in those days. And some of it is fake, you know that, right? Some of it is totally fake. Like Gennaro has the gift of completely demolishing your carefully constructed argument that you spend like weeks. But the thing is, he demolishes it and he makes you think he's in more pain than you. That part is fake. But there's a part that's genuine. And that's like, he never, ever made me think that, I don't give a shit about this correlative business. And he, I think I must be one of the few students whose dissertation barely has an acknowledgement to his work. He never pushed me to read his stuff, and probably he realized I wouldn't understand anything anyway. But, later I often regret, like, your first student doesn't even cite you? What kind of student is that? So for today's talk, when Ivano and Anna Maria asked me to give a talk today, I thought, I'll take something from my dissertation and try to look at it through the lens of what my old advisor, he's also old in both senses of the word, what he would have liked me to do. So I'll start, after 23 years, you become a teacher. So Gennaro, what does this mean? Do you remember? No, he doesn't remember a thing. Something. He's thinking about it. He doesn't remember anything. जो भी लड़की खड़ी है, वो लंबी है, which means whichever girl is standing is tall, or loosely speaking, the girl who is standing, whoever she is tall. Does this kind of make it a little more interesting to you than 23 years ago? जो भी लड़की मेहनत करती है, वो सफल होती है. Whichever girl works hard succeeds. Any girl who works hard succeeds. So we are getting into domains that are interesting. So this is my effort to make right what I did wrong 23 years ago. So with that prelude, I will go to the formal part of the talk, which is, and now I won't look at Gennaro because he's going to kill me for doing this, but what the heck. So I think we'll go back to this picture. Leave it. This one is better, no? Yeah, okay. All right, so what I'm going to try and do today is very preliminary, but basically it's an effort to fit my thoughts into my advisor's way of thinking. Not easy when you don't have a weekly meeting that, where you have every right to fight your case or burst into tears or whatever works with him these days, I don't know. Okay, so you see on page 2, most of you know this stuff, but, I have to, you'll tell me when it's time, right?
Yes.
So, like I said, I'll just stop wherever I am. So on page 2, there's the new book puts together the last 10 years of Gennaro's obsessions, and he has looked at any, more detail and more nuances in the free choice domain than I could possibly try to capture today. But I do notice 2 little gaps. And one of them is a simple one that's to do with the Hindi free choice item, which I think belongs also with any. And I say that with full understanding that part of the reason it's not there in that bottom column is because Lahiri's characterization of koi bhi leaves one piece, leaves out one piece. So that's not the column that I want to sort of fill out. The thing that I want to talk about today is free relatives, i.e. going back to my correlatives, which you can see from the way in which it was translated, have some correlation with free relatives. And in fact, that's one of the things I sort of pointed out in my earlier work, is that correlatives are really like free relatives, not completely, but semantically very close to free relatives. But if you look at this, there's no spot for free relatives. There is a small quote from a footnote kind of a thing, which says that maybe free relatives belong here, maybe not. And he leaves it with that. And correlatives, again, Lahiri set it aside because he was focusing on ek bhi and koi bhi. So that's what I'm trying to do. If one did look at correlatives and free relatives, and if one did want to think of them in terms of free choice, even if they end up not being free choice items, the fact that they have some parallels is worth looking at. So let me first give a couple of just pointers to why I think they may be similar or may even, justify looking at them together. So in 1A, you see John eats whatever Bill cooks, and a normal paraphrase would be John eats anything Bill cooks. They seem almost the same. So those are generic habitual sentences, and in generic habitual sentences, the WH-ever form and the any seem almost to sort of be paraphrases. They seem synonymous almost. And the same holds for the correlative, which I won't go over particularly. But keep in mind, for me, free relatives, correlatives, they're in the same box. So wherever we fit them into this, they would go right there. Okay. Another interesting fact is that we know from the literature on any is that in episodic statements, you can get any in, at least in most of the languages we've looked at, if you can subtract them, if you can add a modifier, appropriate modifier. So if you said, any student who was at the party yesterday is not in class today. So there's a free choice reading of it where this is a universal statement. The same holds for the correlative, and I won't go over that. And then, if you look at the recent literature, you see certain things being discussed about epistemic indefinites in terms that are very similar to what is discussed in the free choice literature. So this ignorance of identity reading, indifference, indiscriminacy, these are terms that are very familiar to people working in the free relative literature. So John talked to whichever student was there, I don't know who, or he didn't care who. This is exactly what we see when we talk about Irgendine or Samen or other, which is less discussed but seems to be in the same class. So the interesting thing is, even people who worked on both free choice any and free relatives, including myself, put them in separate boxes. So this is my effort also to bring the two. I've always felt there's some difference, and intuitively I know what the difference is, but you've got to put in the hard work to figure out exactly how to capture it. So before I get into trying to capture it in Gennaro's system, I want to point out some further puzzles, parallels, whatever you want to call them, between free relatives and free choice any that I think haven't been explored. And this is just to say, even if what I say about the things I'll look at are wrong, maybe there's still good reason to think about free relatives within this big system of polarity. So one interesting thing that I've been noticing for some time, but I don't have an explanation. I'm just giving it as a puzzle. So free choice any is typically good with singular nouns. So for example, you don't say, any fools know how to do that. You really want to say, any fool knows how to do that. This is even stronger in Hindi. And I believe also in Italian, you don't have plural nouns. Now, why we know that generic statements are completely happy with plurals, right? So you can say, fools know how to, even fools know how to do that, etc. Now, one thing could be that, it's something low level, I don't know, but the thing that makes me wonder is that there are two contexts in which you do get plurals quite happily. So I didn't read any books. That's standard, complete. People won't even blink an eye. And more interestingly, when you do subtrigging, plurals are completely okay. So any students who were at the party left early, there's no problem there. And now this is my kind of one more thing. When you think about collective predicates, free choice any, you can't use collective predicates. So you can't really say any students can work together, or unless you do subtrigging. Any students sit in circles. Let's say you make a truly generic statement, you can't really do that. But once you subtrig, it becomes possible. Any students remaining can work together. Any students remaining in class sat in a circle. So I would be inclined to say, okay, this is just a low-level morphological effect. Any develops from indefinite. He's convinced me, I have to say this, whether I believe it or not. Any is not a universal. I publicly deny any previous claims to the contrary. Any is an indefinite, at least today on his birthday. I'll say that without qualification. So maybe it's just that. Every only takes singular nouns. Any only takes singular nouns, except for this one fact that when it comes to these free relative kind of correlative kind of constructions, Hindi also shifts to plurals, and so does English. But I'll leave that as something for the future. What I want to focus on today is this idea of epistemic indefinites, epistemic free relatives, some form of epistemic uncertainty that ever brings into the equation, or any has anyway. The main distinction I want to make is uncertainty about what? About who will have a particular property, or who you're talking about. And so what I want to distinguish a little bit is what kind of uncertainty do you have about the domain of quantification? And I think this is where there is a difference between free relatives and any. I don't know if it's a deep difference, whether it can be derived, but there's a difference. So let me try and get to that. So just to put it on paper, the analysis that the received wisdom from Professor Kirkia is that an indefinite comes to have either existential free choice or a universal free choice reading. And I'm putting in the English because I have better intuitions about that than Irgendine, but I'm basing it, I think Gennaro in his discussion, when he talks about Irgendine, often talks about some and other. So if you say some student or other called, it means basically some student called, and for all the speaker knows, it might be any student. So the speaker is ignorant as to the identity of the caller. And the idea is that you don't see an overt modal anywhere, but the modal is a kind of rescue operation. So the assertion simply says some student called, so if there are two students, either A called or B called, and then the alternatives are that only A called and only B called, and the scalar alternative is, A and B both called, and when you do all your computations, you end up with a contradiction because you're saying A or B called, but not only A, but not only B, and not A and B. So what are you left with? So something's got to be done. And the solution is to posit a covert speaker-oriented epistemic model that takes care of this. So it's now not just that A called, A or B called, and neither one called and both didn't call. It's as far as the speaker knows, someone called, and speaker's not sure whether it was A, whether it was B, and that it was both. So you kind of, by positing a covert epistemic operator, you find a way to rescue this, and you get some and other. You get the effect of disjunction, basically. And then if you look at any, you see this. Now, again, I'm looking at subtrigged. I'm only going to focus on the subtrigged version because that's where the two really come together, because it's really about the actual world. It's about an actual set of students. We just don't know which ones or what their identity is. And so John saw any student who was around. You play the same game. I won't go through all the details, but the idea is that there's this particular structure has the same covert operator. embedded inside the relative clause or within the noun phrase, and that adds this uncertainty on the part of the speaker. Again, I'm only focusing on ignorance, but I think Kondoravdi, Gennaro, all of them have pointed out that the indifference reading is simply you tweak the modal base and you get the same effect. So for my present purposes, it doesn't matter. What I'm really concerned about is once we have this operator, have we made room for my free relatives, or do we still keep them out of the room, right? In a different table. They can't join us here. Okay. So what about free relatives? And now I'm going to probably say things that Ivano may not like, but you still recognize some of them as definite, no? I mean, what the heck, it is definite. Not all free relatives, but some free relatives are definites. And I just give one or two examples to make my case. So, so the way in which people have talked about free relatives and the contribution of ever to free relatives is to say that there isn't an uncertainty about individuals, it's about the identity of those individuals, and the two are very close. So John ate what Bill had cooked means John ate the things, given that there's no noun telling us whether it's singular or plural, the thing or things that Bill cooked. And once you add the ever, you get the reading that the speaker doesn't know what it was, right? If you stay away from the indifference reading. So John ate whatever Bill had cooked, namely ratatouille. That's supposed to be, that's bad because you've named it, so I use the ever. Or John bought, and now the second one shows you that there's some presupposition, it's at least comfortable with there being a salient, contextually salient entity that it refers to in a way that any and some will see are not. So John bought some books. Bill liked whichever books John had bought, he had bought. This is completely acceptable. And for this, we propose this idea of identity alternatives that has been refined over the years, but I think the idea, people tweak with it, but for now we can just stick with the basic ideas that I can point to the person even, as long as I don't know something about some important property about the person. I could even know the name, like if I have a list, but maybe I couldn't, something has to be uncertain about it. So either, I can't say whoever that is because that's Ivano, I know, but if I find the face that I could point to the person and use the ever, free relative, or if I have a list of names in my roster, I can say, wow, John Smith, whoever he is, has aced the exam. So as long as there's some uncertainty somewhere. So that's what identity alternatives was supposed to capture. And now the question is, if we have the system already that kind of puts together subdomain alternatives, existential quantification, and a covert epistemic, speak-oriented epistemic model, do we still need identity alternatives? Or where do they fit into this system? So just to point out, I want that picture. If you don't like the paper, you can look at your picture, Gennaro. Okay, so John ate something or other that Bill had cooked. This doesn't have maximality implicatures, right? So if you say John ate whatever Bill had cooked, he better eat everything, or like everything, whatever. But if you say something or other that Bill had cooked, it could, as long as it ate. So there is this difference between the maximality we associate with definites and the non-maximality that we associate with indefinites. And John ate any dish Bill had cooked also has this, there you have the universal. So there's some difference between the three that I think maybe it's clear to everybody who's been working on this recently, but I still feel there's something more to be said. And 14, John bought some books. Bill liked some books or other that John had bought. That's not good. An indefinite, it's got to be novel, etc. So the thing that I want to push a little bit is, in Gennaro's system, polarity items are always indefinite. That seems to be a very essential piece of it. And if that's the case, and if free relatives are definites, then we have a second conference for free relatives, like we always do. Separate rooms, free choice and free relatives. But maybe not. Anyway, so this is my little desire. So just thinking it through, I thought, let me really try to pin down where the difference comes in or what I intuitively feel. And so I create these 3 contexts. In the first context, the students have to write a book report, and you don't give a list, any book you want. And of course, who is this? Mary. Mary chooses a book that's on the, okay, good. Mary chooses a book that's on the New York Times list. And what ends up happening is, of course, we know that if there'll be many books, right? Many such books. It's an open-ended list. And now if I ask the question, which book did Mary choose? And I say she chose whichever book was on the New York Times list. 4 speakers uniformly give it unacceptable with the free relative. And uniformly, very clearly, it's more than 4, but these are the 4, then I just, I think this is uncontroversial. With some N or other, it's completely okay. And given the time, I'm not going to look at any, just comparing those 2. And then in the second context, there are 3 books, precisely 3 books given, and they have to choose one to write on. And we know that only one of them is on the New York Times list. The speaker doesn't know which one, but what is known is that there's exactly one of these 3. So this is a context, this is context B. And here now you see that Mary chose whichever book was on the New York Times bestseller list is completely acceptable because, the uniqueness presupposition is satisfied. Interestingly, some and other is kind of, okay, maybe not okay, but there's some. I'm going to forget about the any given the time. I'll just focus on these 2. So my point is, this is clear data that shows there's a difference between the kind of uncertainty you associate with. There's a difference between some and n that's crystal clear. Where do we put, how do we wrap our heads around that? And I think the answer is very simple. It's basically, you got to recognize the uniqueness presupposition. Once I'm going to rush through this, but you guys are all well-trained, you'll find the flaws immediately. But the point simply is this, that once you factor in the presupposition, there's only one book on the New York Times bestseller list. There are 2 books, 3 books, whatever. And the assertion says that Mary chose some book from this big list. And then you have the subdomain alternatives. Mary chose A or Mary chose B. But along with that, you have the presupposition. There's exactly one book on the list. Mary chose, so that boils down to basically identity alternatives. That's saying there's one book on the list, and that is Arrow of God. And then when you negate it, it's like uncertainty about each of the alternatives. So my point is, once you build in the presupposition of uniqueness, the subdomain alternatives can be thought of as what identity alternatives were doing. So you get everything. And now I can totally see, how after you're done with your PhD for many years, your advisor speaks like those voices you hear. So I can totally hear the voices. But Vanita, why are there no free choice definites? We have looked at so many languages in all these years. Why are there no free choice definites? Why is there no the with the? Okay, so here's my attempt. And I'll make it really, how much time do I have? 5 minutes? 6 minutes? Okay. So I'll go a little bit quick. Here's the thing. So 17, this is my effort to try to answer that question. So let me say up front, on 16, some version of 16, I'm willing to fight, totally fight, because if you have to recognize that presupposition of uniqueness, whichever way you do it. And it has to have this effect that ends up being the identity alternative idea, okay? So subdomain, with presupposition, subdomain alternatives amount to identity alternatives. So the nice thing is you don't have to say something separate. They're identity alternatives and they're subdomain alternatives. Now, why definites don't have free choice? Okay, this is speculation. So here's what I think. Definites do have free choice versions. They only, I'm on page 7 at the top. So the question is, why can't I put a covert epistemic operator all the way at the top, the way I do it for some and other? Why is it that I need the CP in there? So if I just had the can come with just a noun. why couldn't that work in that case? And so thinking a little bit aloud about this, with free relatives, what do we get for free? Even when they're free relatives, there's a covert head in some sense. There's an N, it could be as bleached as one, whoever is some human being with this property. So there is a sense of the head noun giving you the set, and the modifier carving out a subset of it. In fact, Party in a very early paper had exactly, she said that relative clauses, okay, you get the intersection and all, but there's something more to it. Pragmatically, you don't use a modifier unless you need it to actually, a restrictive relative clause, to actually carve out a subset of the original set, right? So now if we, in my discussion of identity alternatives and definite features, I didn't talk about scalarity because, if you're a definite, it seems like you don't, how could you also then add, if there's only one entity in the domain of quantification and that entity has property Q, you couldn't possibly then have the scalar implicature, not all, right? That would be a contradiction. But maybe we want to look at that. Maybe we want to have the scalar implicature in there. And what would that give us? If you have a modifier, maybe the scalar implicature that not all, or there exists something that is not Q, and I think there's a typo somewhere there. So what you're basically saying, there's only one P, there exists a P that has property Q, and there exists a P that does not have property Q. This is a contradiction. But now if you have modification, then what you can say is there exists only one P in N intersected with R, and that individual has property Q, and now the scalar implicature can be managed by appealing only to the head noun. So there is an N, not with the relative clause, and that N does not have Q. So I think maybe the reason we don't have definite free choice items, the pure basic the basic lexical item, the, in languages that have the definite article, is because its basic form is with just a noun. That's it. Its basic complementation structure satisfied with a single N. But when you have a single N, you don't have room to then say the one entity has Q and and another entity doesn't have Q. Whereas once you have modification, you do. And I'll say that I think it fits in with the general way of thinking that what gets lexicalized are really, you look at the basic form of the sentence, what its core meaning is, or its core structural properties is. Okay, so I want to give my old advisor a chance to say this is nonsense, right? So I'll stop there. I'm aware that there's a lot of, there's a lot more to be done, but that's our life, right? We always like to come up with problems that lead to more questions. So I'm going to stop with that, but I want to say, I see Gennaro looking very uncomfortable, but Gennaro, you can give me, my first homework assignment, the grade he gave me, C+. The second one, C. Oh, so I'll take a C+, let's negotiate. As long as you give me something more for effort, for trying to work within your system, as I should have done 25 years ago, but I couldn't then. But now, I want to end by saying it's a privilege and an honor to celebrate with you, all of you, Gennaro's legacy of a wealth of ideas, rich ideas that he has given us for the last 30 years, and which I'm sure he'll give, I don't know about 30, but 20 at least. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
There is a lot to say, but the only way to do it is just to stick to the content of this, because I cannot talk about anything else and the context. And I shall say that you are not the only one to get C and C pluses in here. As I'm sure.
But he remembers. He was very traumatized. Okay.
No, this is, as usual, very rich, very difficult, and it's going to take me, time to wrap my head around it.
Go ahead. Say what you want to really say.
I just want you to go over more slowly the basic generalization that you're trying to draw, okay? So let me try to, so you're putting any aside. You have also something to say about any, no? But
yeah, I do.
I am trying to understand the difference that you're trying to draw between which book did Mary choose, whichever book was on the New York Times list, and some book or other that was on the New York Times list. You are contrasting, you've considered essentially context A and context B.
Yeah, here.
In context A, Mary chooses all books that were on the list, right?
No, she doesn't choose all, because it's
No.
singular, no? Whichever book, I stuck with singular.
So I'm looking at the diagram in 15, no?
Yeah. So there are many books in the
And she
list.
chose many books, some of which, how are we to interpret that diagram exactly?
Okay, let me, I went fast.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's
And
the
since
thing.
that is the main
That's
point,
the main point.
so let's
for
go
this.
slowly through it so that we get the flip. There is a flip in judgment that I didn't catch. And
Okay, this is the thing. The context, if you take the intersection of books and books on the New York Times list, the context is such that we expect there to be many books, right? More than one. If you have more than one book, now when I say whichever book, it has a uniqueness presupposition. It's like saying the book that was on the New York Times, in effect, right? And people judge that as ungrammatical or awkward in this context. Whereas if you have some book or other, it's completely acceptable.
Okay.
So the uniqueness, the context is set up in such a way that the uniqueness presupposition is not met.
Okay.
And whichever book, singular, crucially, is ruled out. But some and other is okay. In the second context, context B, we make sure that because we have a given set of books to work on, we know that there's only one in the intersection. So the uniqueness presupposition is met. We don't know by which one, whether it's by book A or book B or book C. And that's the one where then they both, whichever becomes okay. So that's to argue for having the uniqueness presupposition be factored in.
Okay. And why, so instead, in that case, the some book or other is uncertain.
And I think they speak of variation a little bit. And I think some students, some people can think of as some book, so with the indefinite, there has to be some book that wasn't chosen, right? And if you think about the whole, it's whether they think of the relative clause as being part of, so there are two, actually I haven't made up my mind. One thing is to think of indefinites as singular indefinites and work with that. And some people can and some people can't. And this is a very small set of judgments, but I think it'll hold if you ask other people. But the important thing is that once the uniqueness presupposition is met, the free relative becomes completely okay. The interesting thing about B was any, which I don't want to bring up now given the time and other people have things to say. But maybe I can tell you later that these contexts become more interesting for any, because there the judgments are sharply not acceptable. With some and other, there are two options. One is to think of them as singleton indefinites. The other is to play with this scalarity being met by the wider noun phrase and the assertion with the restricted one.
Okay, so you're drawing attention on the fact that at least in always maybe, whichever, on the free choice reading, whichever book was on your time list, has a pretty strong
Yeah. Definitely.
uniqueness presupposition,
Yes.
not on the books that were on the waiting list, but on those that were chosen. So there has to be a unique
No,
book.
no, no, no. On the books that were on the list.
Okay,
Whichever books were on the list.
okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that's important. It's on the domain of quantification. Yeah.
Okay.
Because on the choosing, that's constant between some and other, you choose only one. No, it's the domain of quantification.
Okay, yeah, that's, I get the generalization. And it's one that is very hard for me to detect, no? Because,
Is it hard for other people to do
no,
that?
what I'm saying is that in Italian, that otherwise is identical, you don't have that.
And you have, okay, no.
Yeah. So the
yeah.
Italian translation of this, which is with qualunque, and qualunque has the same shape, the same morphological shape, right? I don't get it. Okay, so the only point is that there is a sharp judgment here, but it's probably a parameter of some sort.
You'll tell me
Yeah.
which switch to push.
Okay, so other questions, comments?
Yeah.
Ivano? Speak up or wait for the microphone.
So the question that I had in mind was about what happens with whichever books when you have the plural.
Yeah.
And this can also be related to what Gennaro was saying, because
Right.
in Italian, the so-called, the alleged equivalent of whichever, qualunque, does not take plural.
I thought that might be the case, so even in English, if you just say whatever, you'll have but here's the difference that will come. And I did the test for plurals too. With plurals, first, there are two problems. One is that for a lot of speakers, some books or other is not acceptable. So I had a hard time testing. But to the extent that I could test it, here's the difference. If you say whatever books, or just leave it whatever, then yes, it will become acceptable in context A, but the interpretation will be all of them got chosen. So it's like the definite. It's like saying the books that were on the New York Times. Now, you would have to contextually restrict because it's huge, but whatever, it becomes acceptable, but only under the reading of all of them. And whereas some books or other, to the extent that people get it, they would still do, she wrote on some of them. That's the reading if acceptable. So it doesn't have a maximality effect, the some and other, whereas WHEVER has the maximality effect. So you just make the switch from uniqueness to maximality for plurals, and you'll get, so I would predict that in Italian free relatives, if it's acceptable in context A, you're still getting the entailment that she read all of them or chose all of them, not just one of them, right? So then I would say that it's just a plural definite rather than a plural, rather than a singular definite. The contrast comes out clearer with the singular, which is why, given the time, I just put in the singular here. But yeah, that's the confound that some very natural ways of using free relatives don't put in the head, so you don't know whether it's singular or plural. But you can still test it with checking what the entailments are. So.
Okay, I think we have to stop here. Thanks a lot.